interrupt you, it's because I can't hold that thought in my head a moment longer.
No problem, no problem. I got many comrades like that, so it's all good.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. I'm Chris Richards, as always, the Eclectic Radical. And today my guest is the host of 1+1, Youri Smooter. Tell us about yourself, Youri.
Well, first off, thank you, Chris, for inviting me. It's a real honor to be on your program. I'm actually subscribed to your program, but I have not gotten around to actually watching. But you have very great content. I'm looking forward, hopefully, when summer vacation starts, to actually binge watch it. And yeah, it's a real honor to be here. And yes, I'm Youri Smooter of I'm the host of 1+1, which is your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting, and it's a current affairs history program, and where I interview people like Margaret Kimberly of Black Agenda Report, but also cover a lot of like Eastern European topics. So I'll have Boyan Stanislavski, who's the co-editor of The Barricade, which is a Eastern European left-wing news outlets, and then try to cover a lot of topics which even the best of the American left doesn't cover. So cover a lot, Canadian topics, and then queer liberation politics, and then of course the Black diaspora. Try to cover a lot, Haiti and so forth. And yeah, it's definitely a show for and it's definitely a show for like the left. But also my audience tend to attract actually a lot of people who like the Young Turks, Al Jazeera, Democracy Now!, the Majority Report. So it's a very interesting audience that often will look at like multiple sources. And we're on year 3. We've been doing it for 3 years, and yeah.
Yeah, and this show is geared towards education, both in historical materialism in general and in politics specifically. We talk some about culture and other stuff too, but I mean, generally it's political education, because I'm an American and we're tremendously ill-educated on many subjects. And so I try to educate myself and others.
I think you do a damn good job. And looking at some of like the guests you've had on, and just the exchanges you and me have on Twitter, you very much you very much remind me of the kind of friend I would have like hung out with to talk about like left politics, because very much like kindred spirits, and like we're leftists, which means that like we love we're history buffs, and we're interested in like so many different topics. So it's been very great to have you as a friend on Twitter, and often like retweeting a lot of the stuff. And so again, it's a real honor to be here.
Yeah, and so that's how I ended up and I'm really glad to have you. It's an honor to have you on too. But that's sort of how I ended up in the weird position of a white guy whose biggest crossover audience is with Black Power media.
That is fascinating. That's awesome. No, that's awesome. That's great.
But well, I mean, not a huge crossover audience, but a co-host of mine who's been on your show has done a lot of appearing on Black Power media, and so it just happens that way sometimes.
No, it's great. And we need more of that. We need more of that, because we were even talking about it on Twitter, how it's an interesting time to be alive, because
it is.
Because the state of affairs is so bad. People are screaming for a robust united left movements. Like it's never been a better time to be a black leftist, to be an anti-imperialist. Of course, with the slaughter that's going on in Palestine, I never thought I would live to see the day where, when people are posting pro-Zionist stuff, they're just being pummeled on like Twitter and Facebook and so forth. So it's a great time and yet we have this bizarre we have this bizarre thing where we have some people who are great on such and such a topic, like anti-imperialism, but then they are terrible when it comes to solidarity to our LGBTQIA plus brothers and sisters. And then we have people who are great black leftists, like we'll have like black leftists who are great in anti-imperialism and trying to recreate neo-Black Pantherism and educating people about
Yep.
Malcolm X, W.B. Du Bois, and so forth. And yet, when you ask them sometimes, what's it going to take for solidarity to the, what's it going to take for all of our people power movements to show more urgent solidarity to our Native Americans, brothers and sisters and elders, and sometimes those very same black leftists will say things like, well, once upon a time, some Native American tribes had black slaves, ergo, I'm not going to show them solidarity until they show more solidarity to my people and pay us like reparations. And then this is where I go like, oh my gosh, what is wrong with the left? And then we have some leftists who, I don't know, you would think that they don't give a shit about like patriotism and being like obnoxious about it, and yet they want us to be patriotic, like this whole patriotic socialism movement, MAGA
that
town
movement,
communism. So
it's I'm glad you mentioned patriotic socialism, because that movement is part of the general trend in reactionary politics that I wanted to talk about. That's a more extreme example.
Yeah.
You think about the way politics have gotten more reactionary during the 70s, the less extreme examples, not that they aren't extreme in their own way, are neoconservatism in the United States and neoliberalism in Europe, and the tendency towards centrism and this idea that we went a little too far on some issues for the comfortable folks in the suburbs, and we need to sort of dial it back to make the suburbs more comfortable with the way America is changing, which the Democratic Party hasn't gotten back out of since the 1970s, and that should be concerning to people. It bothers me that it isn't more concerning to people.
Exactly.
But the so-called patriotic socialists or MAGA communists are part of something that is not exactly organic. So this is American mass movement politics, and how the astroturfed mass movement on the far right interacts with the attempts to build organic movements on the far left. And basically a group of, now I'm being deliberately descriptive of a certain kind of white American, because a certain kind of European exists who meets this same stereotype. But picture someone with rich parents, but who affects a look greatly like mine, and who mouths a bunch of right-wing bullshit, while at the same time talking about how all us poor people are in it together.
Yeah, no. I think what you've described is, I mean, you will find people like you will find. Let's not be around the bush. You will find white middle class people who are like that, and that's the kind of liberal that basically Phil Osh was, denouncing in his song "Love Me, I'm a Liberal." And I think also you have this trend that does exist amongst the working class. So these are people who do low-wage jobs, but also do very, very important manufacturing jobs.
Yes.
They'll work at like the factories, and they'll work 24 hours at the McDonald's and so forth like that. And then you'll have like people who are always constantly busting their ass. They'll be working at a bar, then later working at like a restaurant, and then I don't know, tutoring someone and so forth like that. So
Yep.
so that's like a broad like working class, and that's a broad like working class.
Yeah.
And I think what happens is when it comes to the history of the United States, and it's the same thing in Britain and other countries, that working class, of course, is largely white. And if you were to tell those people about how the game is rigged against them and why they need to organize and basically overthrow the system and replace it with a true democratic socialism model or a kind of a Marxist Leninist model, they would be on board for it. That said, that doesn't mean that they won't be sexist, won't be very heteronormative, won't be racist, and won't be xenophobic. And then this is where we have the issue, of racism in places like the United States and Britain, where you will have things like the progressive era, where workers really fought back against the tyrannical capitalist states, the Gilded Age, and so forth. America's, version of, Victorian, Dickensian, very anti, working class, just anti-poor, very grotesque class system that existed in Britain.
Yes.
But that being said, so when you have something like the progressive era, or you have the New Deal era, or even you have the Great Society era of that Johnson and was trying to build, Black people, Latinx people, of a brown persuasion like mine, certainly, indigenous people are going to be excluded from that, and white working class women are also going to be excluded from it, but they still will be advancing their struggle. But Black women, Latinx women, and indigenous women are going to be completely excluded from that, and that is why. And that's why I do have to push back when people, particularly, white leftists, and some of them are friends of mine, some of them I consider comrades. But this is why I do have to push back against a lot of white leftists who bitterly complain about too much identity politics and start to recycle right-wing bullshit like, oh, there's too much wokeism, and like, what is this nonsense about LGBTQIA people? That's identity politics gone.
Even
bad,
the best,
and so forth and so forth.
In my opinion, the consistently best socialist party on questions of fascism and public health in America is also the party whose website trashes Me Too and the 1619 Project.
I know exactly who you're talking about. Shout out to my comrades, and I've had some of them on 1+1, the World Socialist website, right?
I have and it's hilarious because I have a tremendous amount of respect for the work that the World Socialist website does.
Oh, likewise, definitely.
And
likewise.
I have had Joe Kishore on my show several times during his first presidential candidacy, now to kick off his current presidential candidacy, several times between shows to talk about good general history stuff regarding Stalin and Trotsky. And, I do not believe that there is anything close to red-brown about the Socialist Equality Party or the World Socialist website. But at the same time, you would not know it from reading some of their culture content.
Exactly. No, and that also, and yeah, in fact, while continuing on with the World Socialist website as one of those outlets where they're fantastic on, say, anti-imperialism, fantastic when it comes to Julian Assange and calling out hypocritical leftists, enemies from within, and so forth. So they're great on on topics like that. But when it came to, I think I remember when the massive George Floyd uprisings were taking place, I had a very hard time with the American branch's content about how dare they tear down statues of how dare they tear down statues of the founding fathers and so on.
Yeah.
And I always have a problem with one of their members, Nick Beams, who's been on the program many times. When I ask him, look, what would your party do when it comes to the plight of the Aboriginal people? Like, don't you believe in land rights? And don't you think it's a bit problematic when you guys keep complaining about too much identity politics when Indigenous people, queer people, and women, they all do suffer from unique forms of discrimination and of course, you bring up the example of like the progressive era, you bring up the example of the New Deal and how Black people, Indigenous people were, excluded from that. And then that's where it's like I'm talking to somebody it's like I'm talking to somebody in English, and the person can understand a little bit, and he keeps responding in French, and then at some point it's just like, okay, well, we can't communicate. And then another issue I have with the World Socialist website, but I do love the World Socialist website, is of course they are very much anti-communist leftism, and
Yes.
I'm of the very unpopular opinion, but it's starting to become more and more popular that the Western left and the left in general needs to move beyond anti-communist leftism, because it has kneecapped our movement. It has us engaged in self-McCarthyism, self-red baiting, and when you have an issue, and then when it comes to the clusterfuck situation that is in Ukraine, the reason why so much leftists were initially supportive of the Euromaidan movement is because of anti-communist leftism, and this is why it has taken a long time for people to realize that, wait a minute, Stepan Bandera, he was a fascist, but he was only a fascist because he had to fight the Soviet Union.
So I'm going to talk about this because this was not the topic I intended to talk about, but this is good history for people to know. The Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists was founded in 1929. For historical context, in 1929, Ukraine was part of the Second Polish Republic. The area where the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists was founded was called East Galicia.
Yeah, exactly.
It centered on its regional capital was the Polish city of Lwów, which is now the Ukrainian city of Lviv. The way it became a Ukrainian city comes into later stuff with the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists during World War II, and the way that certain Polish and Russian border questions were decided permanently by Stalin and the post-war Polish government, at the expense of Germany, which is also worth talking about, but comes later. But so in 1929, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists was founded in what's now Western Ukraine, and was then East Galicia in the Second Polish Republic. They were explicitly modeled on the National Socialist Party of Germany. Explicitly. They were more extreme in the sense that they carried out an actual program of political assassination within the first year of their founding. Now, what's important to understand about that is their first targets were liberal Ukrainian politicians who wanted to work within the Polish Republic. Their second targets were ethnic Poles in East Galicia. Their third target were Jews and ethnic Russians, whom they considered to be the same people.
Exactly, and I believe that's where the whole Judeo-Bolshevism,
it's why they were so ripe for Judeo-Bolshevism. Judeo-Bolshevism is a German thing, but the Ukrainians were very ripe to buy into it because of their co-identification with Russians and Jews, which has to do with the Pale of Settlement and the fact that they blamed the Tsar and the Russians for putting the Russian Jewish population right in the middle of what is now Ukraine, which is a whole nother story that needs to that's completely separate, that is also worth telling.
Yeah.
Because the history of the Pale of Settlement is very important to the history of Zionism and the modern state of Israel. And so in a very real way, decisions that were made about people who used to live in Ukraine during and after World War II affected the creation of Israel.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. In fact, and for a long time, I remember, because we're bombarded with, with anti-communist literature, we never hear about some of the good social gains that the Soviet Union and the Eastern European communist countries did for, did for the working class of all genders and so forth. And so and I had a really good history teacher. I wouldn't, kind of like a Chomsky meets a softer version of Michael Parenti, who really showed us, like he really broke down like political philosophy for us. So give you a quick example before going back to like anti-communism and so forth. Is I remember walking into my history teacher, Mr. Binns was his name, IB history, walked into a class of his that he was doing called comparative governments. So that class is leaving, my history class is like coming in, and he had on the whiteboard what a liberal democracy was. And on it was, conservation of like traditions, a little bit, separation of church and state, the free market. And I thought that was weird. And then I said to him, wait a minute, to have a liberal democracy, you need to have like the free market, like it needs to be like, like a capitalism.
That's what liberalism is.
And I asked him, isn't that what a conservative democracy is? And then Mr. Binns looked at me like this, and he was like, Youri, okay, he was like, well, Youri, I've never heard of a conservative democracy. We've only had liberal democracy. And yes, part of a liberal democracy is you need to have, the free market. That was when I realized, okay, I'm not a liberal. I'm certainly a social liberal, but I am definitely not an economic, political, socio-economic liberal. That's what led me on my journey to leftism and socialism, Marxism.
And this is the important thing, is that liberalism and social liberalism are two different things.
Exactly.
Yes, social liberalism has traditionally been associated with liberalism for a variety of reasons, mostly political. Because
the S word was banned in the U.S.
Yes, well, that's part of it. But
socialism.
To be fair,
socialism was a dirty word. So if you were considered like a leftist or center left, you were basically like a liberal, and a liberal was basically somebody who said, I'm okay with like black. I'm okay with like black people.
To be fair, to be fair to British liberals and social liberalism, they did support electoral reform, and they did ultimately embrace women's rights. And in both cases, they supported electoral reform at the time when there was no working class party to do it, because working class people couldn't vote. So it was tremendously important that they did it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's number one.
Exactly. And and in Britain, Britain had, the Tories, which was, pro, monarchy and basically believed in plutocracy. And the liberals of that time were the Whig Party, and that party later became the Liberal Party of Britain. That's where your David Lloyd George comes from and so forth. And then at some point, because there was a socialist party, which was Labour, which appealed to the working class, whereas the liberals appealed to, one nation Toryism, or middle class people who certainly, did not like that they were also looked down upon by, the upper class and so forth like that. So the Liberal Party was a broad tent, kind of like what the Democrats used to be. So they believed in noblesse oblige. They were very much, what I jokingly call the real compassionate conservatives.
Well, so
and then
the
later,
irony.
and then of course later,
I
basically the Labor Party.
I will
took
break
over.
in here, which is that ironically, during the great period of liberal Tory conflict, think Gladstone Disraeli, the Liberal Party was better on questions like racial egalitarianism within the British home islands.
Yeah.
I use it very narrowly. I use that. You notice how narrowly I phrase that. And women's rights.
Yeah.
In fact, I believe it was Lloyd George who embraced women's rights at a time when labor was against it. Lloyd George is such an interesting figure for a liberal, one of several people who bear mention of a show of their own someday. But
no, in fact, I'm currently watching Downton Abbey, and I'm on like the last season. And if you're a history buff, folks, check out check out Downton Abbey. I know like period dramas tend to be like a turnoff for many people, but this and Call the Midwife are two very fascinating British dramas, and
my favorite.
They actually go into some of that. They actually go into how David Lloyd George and his faction of the Liberal Party did shake shit up in Britain.
Yes. They wanted home rule. They wanted home rule for Ireland, because at a time when the Irish were just about to start winning their independence, and were checked, viciously checked by their own labor government coalition partners, because they wouldn't go that far.
And then not only that, but just before the breakouts of World War II, or actually during World War II, Winston Churchill decided to become a one nation Tory. Yes. Churchill was always very much like anti-working class, anti-people in general, but he became a one nation Tory because he realized that we're having this war with Germany. We need to mobilize the people, but we can't have this sort of we can't continue on the ways of like Victorian England, where the working class have basically have like no say like in their lives. So that's when they started to believe in like giving the working class wages, giving them full employment, having women employed in factory jobs, because they needed the country to be mobilized in the event of a German invasion.
And then that worked out so well. That worked out so well that all the new voters voted Labor, and Clement Attlee replaced Winston Churchill.
Exactly, because Churchill wanted to go back to the old ways.
Yeah.
in fact, John Pilger, God rest his soul, my hero, who passed away last year, in his last documentary, The Dirty War on the NHS. There's a clip of Churchill going to the industrial north and the Midlands, and he's actually being booed and heckled, and the working class is shouting at him, "We deserve better. We deserve better." And where David Lloyd George comes into this is that basically before that government fell apart, they had what was called the People's Budget, and I'll let you explain to your audience that, because it's a fascinating part of history that's completely overlooked, because labor gets far too much credit than it actually deserves.
Yeah, the People's Budget was actually well to the left of labor at the time. The first labor government would end up being disappointingly conservative compared to David Lloyd George. And
fascinating. It's so fascinating. And in fact, that's what's and but what's also fascinating is this whole concept of one nation Toryism, which which for our American brothers and sisters and the non-binary, I remember when George W.
back
Bush was
during that,
running for office, he would often call himself a compassionate conservative, and
yes,
that's basically one nation Toryism in a
yes,
nutshell. It's yes, we believe in capitalism, we believe in the free market, we believe in conserving, the monarchy and the aristocracy, but we do believe that we have to pay a little bit of tax and use some of that to build social mobility and so forth like that.
mhm.
Nowadays, one nation Toryism is basically I believe in Thatcher's approach to the free market, but I do think that like black people should join our party, and I do believe in like protecting queer people from discrimination,
and
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 yeah,
we should really embrace high caste Indians because they're basically white when you think about it.
exactly. That's basically one nation Toryism today.
Yes,
So if you look at Boris Johnson, who claims to be a one nation Tory, yes, he didn't really care about like trans identities.
Boris Johnson,
He had quite a
and,
multiracial
and I'm using
cabinet and
this
so forth. But
using
the fact of the matter is, Boris Johnson does like he is a child of like Thatcher and
well,
does
let's
believe in like crushing poor people and
Boris,
like all the
Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson is the, and I'm using this word on purpose to insult him because he's so Eurosceptic. Boris Johnson is that rich European kid who tries to look like me that I was talking about.
yeah, exactly. Rich kids pretending that they're
Deliberately
poor,
messing up his
basically.
hair before interviews so he can look like he's a poor guy who doesn't care about fashion.
In fact, a lot of times when Boris Johnson's supporters try to pitch him to people who think that he's so stupid it's amazing, they'll always say, "Oh, Boris only pretends to be like that to appeal to people, but he really is very smart when you talk to him." And for me, Boris Johnson is what my hero George Carlin said about Dan Quayle, the VP under George H.W. Bush, which is he's stupid, he's full of shit, and he's fucking nuts. So yeah, and yeah, so but no, one
Well,
nation one nation Toryism doesn't exist in Britain.
it's fun
If it
fact.
does exist, it's in the form of the Labour Party,
Well,
and the Liberal Democrats even then are.
I've got a hysterical blue MAGA never Trump conspiracy theory for you.
Go right ahead.
So Boris Johnson and Donald Trump were both born in New York City at the same hospital several years apart, while their parents were both living in very close to proximity to one another. And
Wow, I did not know
that. Boris Johnson is one of several interesting world leaders who was either born in or spent a lot of time in America as a child. Another one of them being Benjamin Netanyahu, who the reason, if you really want to think about it, the reason John Fetterman is so pro-Israel is he's really looking out for his Philadelphia suburb constituent Benjamin Netanyahu.
Fascinating. That is quite fascinating. And in fact, Donald Trump's father was German American. His mother was Scottish.
Yes.
And of course,
but the conspiracy theory, though, is Boris, based on considering how old Trump was at the time, knowing what Trump was like, knowing what Boris Johnson's parents were like and some of their issues, is Boris Johnson, and looking at them side by side in pictures, is Boris Johnson the real Donald Trump Jr.?
Could be. It could very well be. I personally think it's kind of a pity that there are so many attempts by the conservative party to like sabotage the special relation when Johnson and Trump were in power, because they're very much kindred spirits. Hence why
Yes,
Boris Johnson and Liz Truss have actually endorsed Donald
of
Trump and
course.
starting to use the same language he uses, like we need to stop the woke retardees or whatever was the phrase he used. But also Boris Johnson, I don't know if it's his father, but he has like some Turkish heritage.
I don't know about that. I know his father is very, very, very blue blood, and his mother is American, if I'm not mistaken, but I could be
No, he was
wrong.
born in no. He was definitely born like in America, but there's some Turkish heritage going on there. There's definitely like some Turkish
No, that's
heritage.
possible
I
because
just don't remember like which
I
parent.
know that I know that a lot of British Orientalists didn't were fine with marrying locally, and
Yeah.
there were a lot of upper class British Orientalists.
But the other interesting thing about Boris Johnson was hard to believe, but he was a journalist. Like he was like a
Yes,
lifelong journalist. Like
a
and not
bad
and not
one, an offensive one, but yeah,
but he was actually like editors of like major like right wing newspapers and like
yes,
magazines. So
yes,
he was like editor for a long time of the Spectator, which is a major
yes.
like right wing magazine publication. He worked for a long time for the Daily Telegraph, which the
Mhm,
nickname is the Daily Tory Graph, and he was
mhm.
their European
Yes,
correspondent
yes.
and like had like and like was living in like Avenue Louise in Brussels, which is
Mhm.
like the very like affluent bourgeoisie, upper
And
bourgeoisie part of
writing
Brussels.
nasty articles trashing the EU.
Exactly, but he was found to like fabricate, lie,
Yes,
engage in a
yes,
lot of half truths, and
yes.
that's why and that's why like the Telegraph had to like demote him or fire him, but they still ended up like supporting Brexit when the referendum took place.
Well, I mean,
So
there was
yeah,
the best thing I ever saw, and please forgive my British accent here, but
go ahead.
there was a meme that was going around when some of the real consequences of Brexit in the terms of customs and such were starting to be felt, and one of them was, "You never told us there'd be no tomatoes, Boris."
Oh, Brexit. Now Brexit is fascinating, and this is where it goes back to our problems with
This is where it goes back to our original topic of right
the left
wingery
right.
since the
Yes, the
70s.
left right alliance. So yeah, okay, so basically, like what happened was, was this. A lot the original Euro skeptics actually was like the grassroots hard left of the Labour Party. Heroes of mine like Tony Benn were
Yes,
warning people that the EU, if you guys go down that EU rabbit hole, you are going to have what happened in Greece, Spain,
yes,
Portugal, Ireland, what happened when Eastern European countries joined and they were, force fed austerity, shock doctrine, grotesque privatization, and whatnot. So it was actually the grassroots labor folks that were Eurosceptic.
yeah,
Those on the far conservative right were people like Enoch Powell, who actually
yes,
did believe in one nation Toryism,
yes,
but he was very much like a flaming xenophobe, and he criticized the EU from a right wing perspective,
yes.
saying if you allow things like freedom of movement and so forth, we're going to be swamped with people not from Britain, and we're going to lose sovereignty, which is the key word
And
that people like Nigel Farage used.
he specifically meant in the Italy of in the British parlance of the time, Spaniards, Italians, and any African people associated with Spain and Italy who would come in their wake.
Exactly. And in fact, Enoch Powell even encouraged his constituency in Northern Ireland, funny enough, and he actually told them and told basically anyone from the Conservative Party that would listen to him to vote for Labor because Labor is going to give us a referendum on if we even should join, and Labor, their grassroots, like the Tony Benns, are actually campaigning that we don't enter the single market. And he was heckled as Judas, and he was saying, no. Judas was paid. I'm making a sacrifice.
Hey, Nazis really believe in their convictions a lot of the time. It's weird but true.
But the sad thing, but the other thing is, but all that being said, and it is true, a lot of the critics of the European Union, like Yanis Varoufakis, who's what I call an EU left reformist, and those who do believe in a left exit, like the late Tony Benn or Tarek Ali and George Galloway, a lot of their criticisms of the European Union, they are right about it, and they have been vindicated in more ways than one on the very real problems of the European Union. But that being said, if I was a British voter, Welsh voter, Scottish voter, or Northern Irish supporter, I would have voted to have remained in the European Union and tried to go for that EU left reformist streak, which, if Corbyn was in power, I think probably like a lot of good would have come out of it.
But of course, Corbyn himself is one of those left exiters who didn't really believe.
Once upon a time, he was very much like he very much believed in what Tony Benn's criticisms of the European Union, but he was forced to adopt at least
the parliamentary Labour Party's position on Brexit as part of the political conditions of his second run.
Exactly.
But
if I was a UK citizen of any kind, whether in Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, or England itself, I would have voted to have remained in the European Union because Brexit was mostly a far-right campaign, far-right reactionary,
an aggressive far-right campaign, and no one paid attention to the so-called Lexit movement of actual socialists and communists campaigning for a left-wing exit. Everybody was paying attention to the racists. Let's be blunt.
But that being said, there was, and it still exists, a faction of the Labour Party that appeals to what's called traditional Labour voter, which is basically the white working class left, the white working class racist, sexist, queerphobe, xenophobe. And Blue Labour, folks, check out Blue Labour. If you really read between the lines, Blue Labour is just it's just left nationalism. It's just left wing. It's just left wing bigots and so forth like that.
So it's just more Tony Blair. In the end, it's more Tony Blair, blue Toryism in the guise of New Labour.
And in fact, many of those on the left who were hardcore supporters of Brexit even deciding not to, either they didn't vote for Jeremy Corbyn, or they voted for the Brexit Party, or they voted for Boris Johnson. A lot of those blue Labour folks, what they call traditional Labour voters, a lot of them now are still engaging in xenophobia and campaigning that Britain leaves the European courts of human rights. A lot of them are engaging in transphobia, and a lot of them basically are the kind of lefties who go on outlets like GB News, which is Fox News with British accents.
I am a classical social democrat, by which I mean Rosa Luxemburg.
Exactly.
And Lenin wrote an excellent essay on Western social democracy, in which he talked about the class compositions of Western labor parties and the racial composition of Western labor parties in relation to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And basically said that what the leadership of Western social democratic movements were looking for was socialism without the working class.
Fascinating. Wow. Jeez. Lenin really was an extraordinary journalist,
And
sociologist. But no, that's perfect. That's
my view of American culture, definitely. And from my understanding as an outsider and talking to my correspondents in those countries, my understanding of Canadian and British and Australian culture is that we are the Anglosphere is a petty bourgeois society. When Napoleon called Britain a nation of shopkeepers, he was hitting the nail on the head in the sense of class consciousness. In many cases, this is a false consciousness. It means that many people in the working class see themselves as middle class, petty bourgeois, while it means that many people in the petty bourgeois have a false sense of the petty bourgeois being the real American class, the real working class, that they, as the plumber who owns his own shop, are working class rather than petty bourgeois.
And in fact, in fact, one reason why I don't like to hear so much of leftists, those of course from a working class background and and are very much Marxist. But one thing which always kind of turns me off when they bitterly complain about the bourgeoisie and so forth is I know many middle class people who, the moment they're in the workforce and they have to take several internships, unpaid internships or poorly paid internships, or they're not going to have their dream job of being a lawyer or having that job working at like a bank, and so they're going to be working at the McDonald's, or they're going to be working at a bookstore, or they're going to be working at like a bar or a restaurant or a fast food place. They automatically are working class. And so I find that that sometimes the working class, those who still work in like big factories and and stuff like that, they're overlooking the new rising working class, working poor, and they need to engage with those people. But that being said, those lower middle class people or those upper middle class people who have to jump from internship to internship, sometimes have to move countries to find a better living, the moment they do have a job that pays very well, they automatically become the very upper middle class, or they become the bourgeoisie or that liberal that Phil Osh is decrying, that that Marxists do want to eradicate when the revolution comes, and so forth and so forth. So it's like a lot of people, even when they are class conscious, they don't know their real identity.
Best story I can think of, Tom Hayden, one of the Chicago Five, one of the founders and leaders of the Students for a Democratic Society, totally sold out and became a neoconservative Democrat in the 1980s. He went to Congress.
Whoa! Wait! Thomas Hayden.
Tom Hayden.
Thomas Hayden. I think
the former Mr. Fonda.
Yeah, I know. I think I was confusing Thomas Hayden for. Jane Fonda's ex-husband, right?
Yes. He went to Congress and became a neoconservative Democrat in the 1980s.
Wow, I did not know that.
That's something that's common knowledge here in America, that a lot of these right-wing liberals are ex-radicals. Another great example are that and some of them are people who you can say very good things about, like Barbara Lee, and some of them are people you can't say very many good things about at all. But a lot of people who were very active in groups like the Black Panthers or the Civil Rights Movement sold out and became liberal Democrats.
And in fact, and that's only getting
Dolores
worse.
Huerta, who was a
worse.
great Marxist in the 60s and 70s, is a Hillary Clinton supporter.
And that really reminds me of Maxine Waters, who in the who in the 1980s was very much like a flaming left-winger. She probably wouldn't call herself like a socialist, but privately she would. And in the 90s, like, she led like investigations into the crack epidemic.
Yes. The CIA. She led the congressional investigation into the whether the guy who allegedly killed himself, the reporter
Gary
who was declared insane after uncovering the CIA crack connection, whether he actually killed himself or whether or not he was murdered at the request of the U.S. government. And now she's disappointingly neoconservative.
Exactly. She was a big Russia. I don't call it Russia Gates, but like a big like anti-Russia conspiracy theorist and so forth.
Another big Hillary supporter.
And then people like the big civil rights. I think John Conyers. I might
John
be mistaken,
Lewis. John Lewis, I believe.
John Lewis, exactly. John Lewis.
John Conyers was also an important figure. Elijah Cummings from Maryland was an important figure. You had people whose roles were exaggerated and still are very much, like the gentleman from South Carolina who helped Joe Biden become president.
Exactly.
Who did represent the students at the Orange, who did represent the families of the students in the court case about the Orangeburg massacre, but whose primary civil rights role was being the political civil rights consultant to a white Dixiecrat who wanted to be seen as pro-integration.
Yeah, no, you cannot make this dark farce up. It's quite fascinating, and that's only gotten worse with.
Now, Joe Biden himself can look like a very interesting plant if you study him closely, because Joe Biden appears at a specific time in political history in Delaware. Joe Biden's first appearance is during the campaign of a Rockefeller Republican governor against a Rockefeller Republican candidate for governor, anti-segregation, pro-Great Society, versus a Dixiecrat Democrat with lots of big money support. And Joe Biden, as someone who refused to register as either a Democrat or a Republican, because of his belief in civil rights and political honesty, felt that he had to support the Republican in this race because he was a liberal too, dang it. So that was his first appearance on the Delaware political scene. After that, he became a Democrat to run for county supervisor, because in Delaware you had to be a Democrat to win county office. They had a machine. And you weren't going to win unless you joined the Democratic Party, no matter what. And he knew it, and it was the only way to win, so he joined. But as a county supervisor, he still proposed bringing federal housing projects to the suburbs in order to put Black people in the suburbs so they wouldn't have to be bused to schools. He wasn't against busing. In fact, he supported busing. But he specifically supported bringing Black people into the suburbs, bringing the projects which terrified people in those days into the suburbs. So now, just a short time later, he was running for Senate. This ties into the topic I originally meant to talk about an hour later, which is that when he ran for Senate, he ran as a Democrat. He was endorsed by the same sort of people who had supported the governor that he had opposed. And he was running against a sitting Republican senator named J. Caleb Boggs. Now, Cale Boggs was the Republican Party minority leader at the time.
Yeah.
He was the co-sponsor of the 1968 and 1964 Civil Rights Acts. His co-sponsor in 1968 was the man who actually wrote the Fair Housing Act, another liberal Republican, a man named Edward Brooke, who was also the only black U.S. senator at the time, and who was the most liberal senator in the U.S. Senate at the time, despite being a Republican.
Wow.
So you have to keep all this stuff in mind. So Joe Biden ran against Cale Boggs, who was aligned with the pro-Democratic Party wing of the Republican Party. And he did so representing the Dixiecrat elements of the Democratic Party, thereby pulling the state party of Delaware to the right.
Wow.
And then, as a senator, one of the first things that he did was co-sponsor the now infamous Biden-Eagleton Amendment, which was an amendment to an annual budget bill that forbade mandatory busing. It was okay. It was absolutely okay for school districts to do voluntary busing, but you couldn't force parents to bus their kids.
Unbelievable. So does that? I've always wanted to ask.
This is important because he represents Eagleton, who was McGovern's running mate. People forget who Thomas Eagleton was. They remember who McGovern was. They forget who Thomas Eagleton was. Thomas Eagleton was the man who, after he had already, slightly before he was chosen as the running mate, but at a time when he probably knew he was going to be chosen as running mate, Eagleton was asked about McGovern by a reporter, and Eagleton replied, "I don't know what McGovern stands for, except that he's for abortion, amnesty, and anarchy." No, I'm sorry. Abortion, amnesty, and anarchy, basically. And this became a Nixon line.
Wow.
And this was the guy McGovern ended up choosing as his running mate, and Biden's co-sponsor of the Biden-Eagleton Amendment. So you have to remember that the same people who forced Eagleton onto McGovern's ticket are the same people who supported and elected all the 1972 Democrats, who were people who put up anti-war signs on their businesses, but campaigned to the right of liberal Republicans to win their seats.
That is so fascinating. But then...
And this is the Democratic Party revolution. This is why the Democratic Party was full of neoconservative Reagan Democrats when Ronald Reagan came along. Because in 1972, this faction of the Democratic Party was already forcing Thomas Eagleton onto the McGovern ticket and putting all these right-wingers into office as anti-war candidates.
But then how do you explain... I've always wanted to ask somebody this, because no matter what you watch, they never really explain it, which was when George H.W. Bush appointed Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court, and we had the Anita Hill scandal and hearings. Now, Reagan, actually did manage to get a lot of his regressive policies passed and radically changed the system, but he had a Democratic-controlled Congress his entire 8 years, and even George H.W. Bush. The Republican Revolution, that only happened when Clinton was president.
Yep.
So Joe Biden, if Joe Biden and the Democrats had like enough power to
So,
yay or nay a Clarence Thomas,
so there are
why
three things.
why was Joe Biden so aggressively like anti Anita Hill and paved basically the way for
So
Clarence Thomas, who's one of the most like,
there
reactionary
are three
douchebags
things
in the
that
Supreme Court.
there are three things that are really important to remember. And the first one is one of the things that ties into all of Joe Biden's illusions about who he is as a person, which is that number one, the Supreme Court is not political. So you have to understand that during the 1980s and 1990s, most Supreme Court justices, if they were not controversial to specific wings of the parties over issues like abortion, were voted for pro forma. I mean, people who bitterly disagreed with Richard Nixon voted to put William Rehnquist on the Supreme Court in the first place, and Democrats who bitterly opposed William Rehnquist's Supreme Court body of work voted for William Rehnquist to be Chief Justice. I mentioned this on Twitter in a conversation. I haven't had the chance to talk about it on the air, so I'm glad you asked this question. Reagan had the power to end abortion and break Roe v. Wade back in the 1980s. The reason it didn't happen was because people still cared about things like blue slips. Now, I don't know if you know what a blue slip is or not. But for anybody who doesn't, a blue slip is a letter from a senator of a specific state saying a judge from that specific state is of good character and good legal qualifications to be a Supreme Court justice. Now, a blue slip from both senators from a judge's state is considered necessary for any Supreme Court appointment. And this was really taken seriously in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan was president. Ronald Reagan wanted to appoint people, and in fact did try to appoint people like Robert Bork to the Supreme Court. He wanted.
But there were enough people power movements,
but I mean, Teddy Kennedy led.
Responsive enough that you could kneecap
Teddy Kennedy,
reactionary like what we have nowadays.
Teddy Kennedy stopped Robert Bork as this is ridiculous. This is too reactionary. We cannot let this happen. And they actually voted against Robert Bork. It was one of the first times that had ever happened. And you still hear Republican conservatives to this day blaming Democrats for politicizing the Supreme Court for unfairly attacking Robert Bork because he was a white supremacist.
And boy, oh boy, has the Republican Party, as the late Glenn Ford used to say, the white man's party, boy, oh boy, have they become a fascist party, man.
They really have. And to the point where even fascists like Joe Scarborough, who were integral to them becoming fascist, feel like they have to be Democrats because Joe Biden is just fascist enough, but not too fascist.
No, but like I don't like, of course, the use of the word Nazi as an insult and fascist as an insult has been very much overused, and I am of the opinion, when you're arguing, with, when you're trying to make
I disagree.
Trying to make the anti-imperialist case that we should not overthrow Assad in Syria, we should not set Libya on fire, we should not have like endless Cold Wars with anybody who heads Russia. You'll always find
it's all really complicated because if somebody said to me, America should make a clear commitment to protect Rojava from both Assad and the Turks, I would say, fuck yes, America should do that. America would never do that.
Exactly.
America would never do that. I want to be really clear about all you people who support America because Rojava. America will never actually step in to save Rojava if it becomes necessary. America has never stepped in to save any of their allies if it becomes necessary. Look at Afghanistan. Look at South Vietnam. America will eventually always lose when the people of America get tired of sustaining a specific imperialist project. It's just a matter of time.
Exactly. And America always supports reactionary movements.
Yeah.
America always supports reactionary movements. But what I wanted to say about fascism and in relation to the Republican Party is I know that the word is overused, overabused, and I am of the opinion that we need to move beyond World War II, which is another topic for another day. But all that being said, I do not see at the current Republican Party, of Donald Trump and not say that this is a fascist party. I think if George Carlin was alive, he would definitely say that, like, American fascism has finally arrived and it has come into the form of Donald
I would say it's come in the form of Donald Trump and Joe Biden, but that's a whole nother argument. But
exactly.
And this is really important. I think it's important to use the word Nazi. As an American, I think it's very important to use the word Nazi. And the reason this is because it's the U.S. government that is the reason that so-called neo-Nazism exists. So-called neo-Nazism is not neo in any way. It is a straight continuation of original Nazism. And the reason it was possible is because the American government made a concerted effort to save the Nazis.
Exactly. And Canada too. And
but the Canadian and British efforts to save the Nazis and the French effort to save the Nazis were all associated with the general American decision to save the Nazis. Because at that point, America was setting policy and the others basically had an advise and consent role. We can exaggerate America's power over its allies sometimes, but it's also dishonest to deny that America is the hegemon.
Exactly. And in fact, one important thing when it comes to arguing with Western do-gooders who have been duped that were supporting a liberal democracy in Ukraine, or that Afghanistan was the good war, whereas Iraq was bad war. One thing which is very important to explain to people when it comes to anti-imperialism is that it doesn't matter whether it's a democratic left government or an autocratic government like, my mother's country of the Congo under Mobutu. America, when they decide, Mobutu, we no longer want you. When they decide, Viktor Yanukovych, he's center-right, but I prefer this guy, Poroshenko. When America decides that you're expendable and they replace you with somebody else, it is always going to be a reactionary movement, no matter how well the propaganda is that Ukraine is all about, like Western social liberalism, or Afghanistan is all about like us eradicating the Taliban and propping up a secular thing. It's always going to be reactionary politics.
And Syria was never about Assad. It was about promoting ISIS as the primary opposition to Assad, so that no actual democratic movement against Assad would arise.
And it is a lie. It is a lie that when the U.S. does support Kurdish left nationalism, it's just BS. Yes, the Kurds have legitimate grievances which do need to be addressed. But when America is supporting a Kurdish movement in Iraq or a Kurdish movement in Syria, it's always an ethno-nationalist movement who, when they get into power, if you ain't a Kurd, they are going to push you out.
So I'm going to talk about this. This is important. Okay. So this is the area that where many very principled, and I'm able to say this because despite what I would call closer, if I were anything, I'd call myself an autonomist or a libertarian Marxist now. But I come very much from an anarchist background.
Yeah.
And I still believe very strongly in certain core anarchist ideas in what I think are the correct terms, as opposed to what I would say the curiously interesting and anal anarchists believe. But that's a whole nother argument. But so speaking as someone, so the Kurdish national movement renounced nationalism in the 1990s. The Kurdish national movement is a democratic federalist movement opposed to nation states and basically arguing for a communalist. I can never say the word despite being an anarchist. A communalist model based on the work of Murray Bookchin as expounded upon by the formerly Marxist leader of the Kurdish national movement while he was in prison. Well, and still is.
But that's the Kurds from Turkey, right?
So this is where it's really important to understand how this works. This is the People's Party for the Liberation of Kurdistan. This is, again, a pan-national movement that is based in Turkey. The leader is Turkish and in a Turkish prison, but the YPK in Syria and the party by the same name in Iraq are both associated with his movement and ultimately consider him to be the leader and follow his philosophy. The whole point of Rojava is that it is an experiment in democratic confederalism in action. There are Abyssinian Christian communities in Rojava. There are Kurdish communities in Rojava. There are Coptic communities in Rojava. There are Shiite communities in Rojava. And they all, ironically, specifically the specific Shiite sect of the Assad family, because
Alawites, right?
The Alawites, yes. There are Alawite communities in Rojava because the Alawites are actually a small minority of the Syrian Shiites and are traditionally oppressed by the others. But anyway, so all of these communities have joined Rojava in various levels and all participate in what is called the Syrian Democratic Forces, which have both done good things and which there have also been scandals relating to. And it's very hard to dissociate the good things from the scandals because of the way the Kurds have become necessary on American support in their total absence of other allies. Which ultimately means that there are lots of great things to say about the Kurdish movement, but in the end, there's always going to be a strong CIA stooge element within them because it is to the West that they owe their existence.
Fascinating.
Separate from the CIA stooge element, the Kurdish national movement is extremely, extremely legitimate. Debbie Bookchin frequently goes to Rojava. Her Twitter account is not terribly active, I don't think, anymore. Before he died, the late David Graeber did a lot of tweeting about her activity in Rojava. So there are lots of good things to say about Kurdish anarchists, and I have a lot of respect for a lot of Kurdish anarchists. And I have read the works of the gentleman in the Turkish prison. His shit is brilliant. And while I am not a sectarian, and I do not advocate, I do not want anyone to either dump Marx for Bookchin or dump Bookchin for Marx, I would strongly encourage Marxists to engage more with the ideas of this man. But that said, because of the necessary facts on the ground, his organization has a large wing of CIA stooges that cannot be avoided when the U.S. is your only ally in the world.
Yeah. No.
And it's and a horribly unreliable ally too. And yet they keep having to come back because they don't have anywhere else to go.
In fact,
It's
that's
very much an abusive relationship, in my opinion.
Well, in fact, one of these days, I'm thinking about who would be the perfect guest, who would be the perfect panel to have this. But one of these days, maybe we can do it on your program. We do have to have a discussion, which is the moral dilemmas that come with being an anti-imperialist.
Yes.
So, for example, when it comes to
well, Iran is the perfect example.
Oh, Iran's a perfect example still because
if
I'm a
ask an Iranian communist what they think of the current Iranian state, they will tell you that it is very much not a worker state or a revolutionary state. But if you ask a Western Marxist what they think of Iran, they will tell you it is a revolutionary Marxist state.
Or they simply go with the with the principle, which is we've done enough mess in Iran. Let the Iranians fix it, and let's not.
Well, I'm an anti-intervention.
Let's not be Western do-gooders and demand that our government sanction Iran more and support a reactionary movement.
Which is the position of the Iranian communists. We don't want no U.S. help. And I apologize for slipping into some vernacular there, but that is the position of the Iranian communists. They don't want U.S. help.
But there's also the moral the moral dilemmas that come with being an anti-imperialist.
Yes.
That also comes into the form of Burma. So a comrade, I believe Daniel G, who writes for the Canada Files, which is a very great anti-imperialist outlet which focuses on Canada's imperial role in the world, and he did an interesting article about Burma, which for a long time, it's been very much a pro-Western military junta, which suppresses its people terribly. Aung San Suu Kyi is the descendant of the first democratic socialist government they had, who was quickly overthrown in a coup. Now, Aung San Suu Kyi, the moment the West started, the moment the West started to have more influence over her, and she started to become, out of, prison and working with the junta and so forth.
It's like what happened to Mandela once the West embraced him.
Exactly. And that's where her staying very silent on the brutal oppression of the Rohingya came in. But basically, she also started to dampen her socialism and thought, yes, it's okay, guys, come to Burma. Burma is like open for business. And for whatever reason, she got too big for like her own boots that the military junta threw her back under house arrest. And now the U.S. government is sanctioning the Burmese, but not because of their genocide of the Rohingya. It's because that Burmese government wants to be part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. So when it comes to a country like Burma, I have no idea what to do with it as an anti-imperialist. That's one of those like.
Well, the trouble is that countries like Burma or South Africa or Israel are U.S. proxies. And when a revolutionary movement becomes powerful enough to overthrow the U.S. proxy state, the United States has to either repress or embrace it.
Exactly.
The first move is always repression, which was why Mandela was in prison in the first place. And prior to the period of embrace, Nelson Mandela was a communist who was in prison for a very successful campaign of blowing up police stations and assassinating judges. This cannot be forgotten. This is why he was in prison.
That is one of those inconvenient truths which the best of the left, the best of the anti-racist left, very much minimizes or censors it. So a lot of people don't even know why Mandela was
and this goes to this whole.
They just think that he was in prison because he was the leader of the ANC. But actually,
when he is embraced by the West, he suddenly becomes a Gandhian or MLK Jr. sort of figure. I'm sorry, baby. He moderates his position on land reform. He moderates his position on getting Afrikaners out of government. He modifies all sorts of positions to the point where Winnie Mandela divorces him and says he made too many concessions to white people.
And she was later smeared. And
who knows how much of that is true and how much of it isn't. I will say that lots of things happen in an armed revolutionary movement that is doing clandestine things. Not all of those things are admirable. Yeah. And we have a choice to either understand and forgive or to judge and not support the movement, as we are morally comfortable doing. I don't like using the very right-wing argument that you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. But bad things happen. Bad things happen under revolutionary stresses. Heroes like Lenin and Leonard Peltier have authorized some fairly awful things in the name of internal security of revolutionary movements, including in the case of a famous case here in the US, murdering an innocent woman because they were led to believe that she was an FBI informant.
It all makes perfect sense now. Interesting. Fascinating.
So no revolutionary movement in history has ever been perfect. Lenin had internal security people who shot people for not being trustworthy. And while it was considered necessary at the time, consider that in any paranoid situation like that, there are always innocent people who are considered not trustworthy by someone. And if that's and this is the danger, of those same internal security movements. They are both, on the one hand, it is true that internal security and counter ops are absolutely necessary for survival, but they are also the part that discredits our goals and makes us do things that make us look bad and that lose us support. And in
fact, that's actually a perfect segue into the whole issue of anti-communist leftism.
Mm-hmm.
Your audience should definitely check out my interview with Boyan Stanislavski, where we just talked about the history of Poland during the Cold War. And Boyan, at the end of the at the end of the conversation, when we were sort of wrapping up, and I was saying to him, like, don't you feel that there are some leftists who think that communists should be much more apologetic about about some of the human rights abuses and so forth. And Boyan at one point was going, look, it was a very dark period what happened during Stalin and during and during other people, but it's one point, but it's one chapter, and people completely miss the entire chapters. And when people talk about bread lines and so forth, yes, there were bread lines because actually the country was on strike. And he says, like, I'm not going to apologize for Stalin when the guy is dead. And like, and then he was saying, Youri, do people honestly think that I believe in wiping out my political enemies and putting them into concentration camp? Who thinks like this?
Even Stalin, who had many faults, did not necessarily think like that to the degree we believe he did.
Exactly, and this is where a lot of half-truths get weaponized. About Stalin, which is an interesting topic in and of itself.
The Gulag Archipelago was written by monarchy.
what I think going forward when it comes to moving past anti-communist leftism is the following. We acknowledge that horrendous shit did happen. And I'm not saying that we minimize whatever awful atrocities did happen during the Cultural Revolution of Mao Zedong, when Ho Chi Minh was eradicating the Vietnamese collaborators and those who benefited from French colonialism. We don't minimize some of the horrendous shit that did happen, and I personally have a very hard time with the Bolsheviks murdering little Anastasia and stuff like that. That being said, as historians and as leftists, we have to also look at the goods, the good that did come out of it, and basically learn from some of the mistakes. And by the way, every single communist I've talked to, one from the former Yugoslavia, one from Vietnam, my friend, two Polish leftists, and they all, when I ask them about human rights abuses, they all accept that horrendous shit did happen, and they're honest with me about it.
Well, and if anybody ever says, well, one of the things that people say to me, one of the things that I hear sometimes is, well, leftists should apologize for Castro locking up gay people. Well, Castro apologized for that. Why do we need to apologize for him? He apologized for that.
And now Cuba is one of the
passed
anti-heteronormative places to be, compared to the democratic socialist governments of other ones in which queer people are still discriminated
against. Passed a
constitution. That being said, that does not mean I'm going to support the next color revolution that happens in Bolivia, in Guatemala, in Ecuador, and so forth.
In Venezuela. There are lots of criticisms you can make about Venezuela. I have a friend whose wife is Venezuelan, and they're currently living in Colombia under Petro after leaving New York because he's scared of living in the United States because he's Jewish. And he's an anti-Zionist, so he's not scared of living in the United States because he's Jewish, because he supports Israel. He's scared of living in the United States because he's Jewish, because he sees Trump.
Yeah.
And he understands what people like Trump mean for every traditionally targeted group in European and Western circles. And so he's realistic. But he knows lots of Venezuelan communists, and he knows what the Venezuelan communists think of Maduro and the Chavistas. And he understands the shortcomings of Chavismo and how it's not truly Marxist. And yet, at the same time, he's against sanctions and color revolutions and U.S. intervention.
In fact, and this is why I think going forward, I think in order to advance...
This is him.
And also, in order to advance the anti-imperialist movement, this is where my friend Eve Engler's political philosophy for international relations, it should be the first do no harm. So, Western imperialism has fucked up Iran. Western imperialism through color revolutions and whatnot has fucked up Russia, which resulted in the rise of Putin. So now that all of that damage, but now that all of that damage has been done, how do we go forward? First, do no harm. It is up to the Russian people themselves, the Russian left movement themselves, to overthrow Putin and replace it by a system in which it's socialism with Russian characteristics. The Iranians know their country better than anybody else, and there will come a time where a secular left movement will overthrow the government, but they do not need our help. They certainly need solidarity, but they do not need us cheerleading our Western imperialist government who are really support a secular left movement. And if they do, it's going to be something of an MEK persuasion or something of a neo-Shah.
The the current Twitter spokespeople for a quote unquote free Iran is a constitutional monarchist who wants the Shah's family to come back.
Which is,
Now, on the subject of Russia, I want to point out something else that a lot of people don't know about countries like Russia and Ukraine. At the time that the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union fell, the most powerful political party that wasn't the Communist Party in Russia was the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, which was a Russian nationalist movement with pro-Nazi elements, heavily funded by the American Heritage Foundation. Yes, that Heritage Foundation.
Exactly.
The largest political party in the Ukraine at that time, when the Soviet Union fell, was the Ukrainian People's Movement. Now, when people say no major Ukrainian parties are Nazi, they somehow completely ignore the Ukrainian People's Movement, whose former president Poroshenko was wearing Nazi insignia when he made a big deal about his public joining of the Ukrainian army a couple of years ago now.
Yeah, exactly.
And this was also funded by the Heritage Foundation. Yes, that Heritage Foundation during the Cold War. So the Republicans, not just the United States, the Republican Party put Putin and the current Ukraine and the current Ukrainian government in their positions. And now there's this whole thing between Republicans who remember that Putin was sort of their guy once, wanting to support Putin, and other Republicans who want to follow the national security position on Ukraine because they remember all the money that the Heritage Foundation invested in the Ukrainian People's Movement.
In fact, before Viktor Yanukovych was elected to be president of Ukraine, the two previous leaders, the one who was mysteriously poisoned, people still think it was the Russians that poisoned him, and then there was a woman, I believe, from his party that came after.
Yes. I can never pronounce her name, but
exactly. And
Yulia.
both of them in their party platforms, their agenda was to make Ukraine
Yulia
the
Tymoshenko.
only official language.
Yulia Tymoshenko.
Yeah, exactly. So
she was prime minister when Poroshenko was president. Also, it is important to understand, she was the prime minister who took office because of Euromaidan before there was an election, and who was therefore in charge of the elections that happened.
And what they all have in common was they wanted to make Ukrainian the only official language. Viktor Yanukovych, not a lefty, center right with Ukrainian Eastern European characteristics, he ran on making Ukraine a bilingual country in which Ukrainian, Russian, and a little
keeping Ukraine a bilingual country. I want to be clear on that, because, and people don't understand this, that first president, the one allegedly poisoned by Putin, during his election, there was a Supreme Court case about whether or not Ukrainian citizens living in Russia, people who were Ukrainian who were registered under the Soviet Union as Ukrainian nationals, and therefore legally citizens of Ukraine if they wished to claim their citizenship, and many of them did. There were many dual citizens of Russia and Ukraine at the time. They argue, can Ukrainians in Russia vote absentee? And the rules at the time said they could. And the man who became president during his election went to court to argue that they shouldn't be able to. His lawyer was a man named Roman Zvarich. Roman Zvarich co-founded the Congress of Ukrainian Nationalists with a woman named Slava Stetsko. Slava Stetsko was the widow of Yaroslav Stetsko, who was the CIA's flunky running Ukrainian Nazis during the Cold War after Bandera was killed, and who was Bandera's sidekick fighting the Soviets for the Nazis during World War II.
Unbelievable.
His widow's co-author was that guy's lawyer, arguing that Ukrainians living in Russia should not be able to vote absentee in Ukrainian elections.
And by the way, the prime minister who both of us names we are blanking out. This is during the Bush administration. He was supposedly, allegedly poisoned by Putin. Viktor Yushchenko.
Yes,
and then
Viktor
after
Yushchenko.
him, and then after him was a guy called Anatoly Kanash, I think.
Yes.
And then came Viktor Yanukovych, and he was later overthrown in that Euromaidan color revolution.
Yes.
Actually, no. After him came Yulia. After her was a Yuri, and then came Viktor
Yanukovych again.
Has been like prime minister. Like many
they were going back and forth for a while in elections, like Republicans and Democrats.
Fascinating shit. Anyhow, but
during that first period, Yanukovych was our friend.
But that being said, long story short, is Yushchenko and Yulia, whatever, and Poroshenko all ran on Ukrainian should be the only official language. Deeply upsetting Ukrainians of a Russian-speaking background. As Yasha Levine has said, the people the West is supporting in Ukraine are the most reactionary Ukrainians who are
It is true to a certain extent that the Russians supporting the breakaway republics in the Donbass are the most reactionary Russians. But that does not change the fact that civilians were being bombed by the Ukrainian National Guard before Putin invaded. And that what else was Putin supposed to do when some of those bombings were starting to spill over into refugee camps on the Russian side of the border?
And it's also important to know, and I do say this as somebody who doesn't support Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because I felt Russia's invasion of Ukraine makes the anti-NATO case that a lot of us are trying to do even more harder, and his invasion only makes Ukrainians, some Ukrainians obviously, go into the arms of the neo-Banderite movement, in which and Zelensky's not in control. He's just a puppet of whomever are his reactionary oligarchic backers.
As should be understood by the fact that he ran on a platform of disarming the Nazis and making peace with the Russians, and actually delivered on trying to disarm the Russians while making peace with the Nazis.
Exactly, and in fact, I don't have it with me. I'll definitely try to have my friend Boyan send it to me. When he was, even running for office, he was saying things like, "Hey, if Ukrainians want to speak Russian, let them speak Russian. If Ukrainians want to speak Ukrainian, let them speak Ukrainian. We're all Ukrainians."
And part of, I don't mean to attack identity politics, but I do mean to attack identitarian politics, which is a very different thing. Part of the appeal of Zelensky was that he was both Jewish and Russian speaking. Therefore, how could he possibly do anything bad to people in eastern Ukraine?
Exactly, and I think that being said, a lot of, I guess you could say, in some ways, a lot of journalism, malpractice took place, because I think before RT got censored. For example, I can't watch RT on like YouTube, can't
Yes.
access their website because it's censored in
And
all
RT America was shut
EU.
down.
Yeah, and I think what happened was, because, let's face it, Russia is not led by a leftist. Russia is led by a fiscal and socially conservative person. So a lot of people who would get their news on Eastern European and Russian affairs, we all thought that we were all led to believe that Zelensky wasn't, wasn't, a capitalist and so forth, or that he just was a liberal that wanted like peaceful coexistence between the Ukrainians and détente with Russia. But actually, through the journalism of, of Scott Ritter and the Gray Zone, he actually always was going to be like a capitalist scum fuck.
The primary backer in his election is the same guy who is the primary funder of the Azov battalion before it officially joined the Ukrainian National Guard, and who is one of the primary civilian funders of the Ukrainian National Guard since it has become Nazi.
In conclusion, Zelensky was always a grifter and was
always
never,
a front for was always an Obama figure, if I can be forgiven for saying that. Somebody who was used to appeal to identitarian politics at the expense of real identity politics.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a shame. I don't know how the situation is going to end, but Comrade Boyan, he believes, and I've talked to Ukrainian Canadians from leftist backgrounds and from not, and basically they believe that that one of two things could happen. Ukraine will be partitioned. You'll have Western Ukraine with Kiev as its capital. That's going to be aligned with the EU and NATO. And East Ukraine will just be will either be its own country recognized by Russia and much of the international community. And those Ukrainians who don't believe in that project will just move to West Ukraine, because they may not like Western capitalism, but they are not on board with capitalism with Russian characteristics, which is what Putin basically is.
Yeah.
So Ukraine will not be so Ukraine as we know it will be basically split and so forth.
Well, it's
and
so
yeah,
the history of modern Ukraine is the history of three different places, historically speaking. It is the history of the Donbass and Crimea, what we call Eastern Ukraine, which is historically Russian and was made Ukrainian as part of the deal with borders with the Poles, as part of a series of territorial compensations based on the illusion that the Soviet socialist republics were autonomous socialist republics in addition to being part of the Soviet Union, which I don't believe was ever actually true, is more like being states or provinces.
Yeah.
But that said, based on the theory that the Ukrainian SSR really was independent, they were included in the border settlement with Poland because all of the Soviet territory that was given to the Poles had been Ukrainian. All of the Polish territory that was given to the Soviets had also been Ukrainian. But and so Khrushchev, believing that Stalin had stiffed the Ukrainians, gave what's now Crimea and East Ukrainian to the Ukrainian SSR.
Exactly, yeah.
So that's Eastern Ukraine. And the fact that people there are culturally Russian rather than culturally Ukrainian, even more than the language they speak, because plenty of people in West Ukraine and Central Ukraine speak Russian too. Even plenty of the Ukrainian nationalists who want to make Ukrainian the official language speak conversational Russian in their own families. So it's complicated. But
no, it is. In fact, one of my friends, one of my best friends, his girlfriend is from Ukraine, Kharkiv, which is where, which is the hotspot of the war right now. She's lost family members to the Russian invasion, and it's interesting because I believe she would definitely be one of those people where if Russia wins the war and that eastern part of Ukraine becomes its own separate country, she would definitely be one of those people who would prefer to live then in a Western allied Ukraine with Kiev as its capital, as opposed to one,
and then you've got
as opposed to one that's going to be more friendly to Russia under Putin or anyone else.
Then you've got Kiev, which is the center of traditional historical Ukraine and the traditional city and center of Ukrainian nationalism, and which is the most Ukrainian part of Ukraine, historically speaking. And then you have Western Ukraine. Western Ukraine is East Galicia. Ukrainians are historically a minority there. The ethnic majority was Polish, and because of the presence of the Pale of Settlement, it is one of the few places in the world where Jews at the time formed a majority of the population in certain parts of the area.
Fascinating.
That is Western Ukraine, centered on, again, the formerly Polish city of Lviv, which is now the Ukrainian city of Lviv. The Lviv massacres during World War II, the ethnic cleansing of the city of Lviv by the Banderites. These are central to the history of World War II. And if you are a patriotic Ukrainian communist or a patriotic Soviet communist, the Banderites are the bad guys. They're collaborators with the Nazis. But if you believe that Stalin was the worst thing in history, then then Stefan Bandera was George Washington, and doing business with the Nazis was just that necessary doing business with the King of France.
In fact, I remember because that faction of a very well-funded, Western-funded diaspora movement. This goes back to why
which goes back to the fact that lawyer Roman Zvaric, co-author, co-founder of a party with Slava Stetsko, heir to the Banderite political legacy in Ukraine. He's an American who was born in Queens and who gave up his citizenship to go back to a country he had never lived in and become a Ukrainian as soon as Ukraine became independent.
And in fact, because and again, this goes back to why we need to move beyond anti-communist leftism, is because when one is taught in the West, but even but I'm pretty sure it's also the same in Eastern Europe now. We are taught that Stalin killed more people than Hitler. Well, of course he killed more people than Hitler. He lived longer.
More importantly, he held power longer.
But the whole communism is just as evil as Nazism. A lot of that comes.
I think we're breaking up here for a moment. I don't know if people can see my stream or if it's my stream that's frozen, and that's why Youri looks frozen to me. Okay, I think we're back.
Am I back? Am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, perfect. Okay, yeah. So what I was saying is, of the very well-funded Eastern European diaspora community, who have very innocent-sounding names like the Polish League of Canada, the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, and their sister versions in Australia, America,
the
were
anti-Bolshevik bloc,
Yeah.
the bloc of anti-Bolshevik nations. That's the one. The bloc of anti-Bolshevik nations.
These organizations were founded by runaway Nazi war criminals and collaborators and so forth. And then people like Chrystia Freeland,
Yes.
people like Chrystia Freeland, who's the second in command of Justin Trudeau. Her grandfather was a Nazi propagandist collaborator. And
Yep.
she's part of movements like the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, who, when it comes to the Euromaidan movement, actually supports Sevboda and the literal neo-Banderites movement in Ukraine and other reactionary rival oligarchs, rival Nazi movements in Eastern Europe as a whole. And their friend Navalny in Russia is part of, like, the guy is just a rival far-right oligarch and so forth. So you can overthrow Putin tomorrow. If that guy had lived and was to be installed, or what's his face, Bill Browder, Russia will still be a fiscally conservative, socially regressive country. It's just they're going to be the son of a bitch friends of the West, the U.S., Canada, the European Union, and so forth.
The reason that the Canadian Ukrainian diaspora has so much power is because of the amount of Canadian capital invested in Ukraine. Bill Browder is a dual Canadian American citizen. There was a lot of Ukrainian capital invested in Russia that was nationalized by Putin.
Exactly. It's the old say, why. So in a nutshell, why does the West hate Putin? Why do we even have an industry of anti-Putin derangement syndrome? It's because Putin is not their son of a bitch.
Remember when Mitt Romney was ridiculed in 2012 for saying that I foresee Putin's Russia being our number one security problem? And everybody laughed at him. And Democrats used this as proof of his political immaturity. And then all of a sudden, Democrats are making Putin's Russia the big villain and trying to make nice with people like Mitt Romney and the Republican Party. And this is one of my favorite facts of history.
Yeah.
There was once a Democratic senator named Max Cleland.
Yeah. Max
Cleland was from Georgia. He was extremely liberal for a Southern Democrat. He was one of the few senators. Well, he was the first senator in a wheelchair, and had only part of one arm left. Everything else was gone.
Yeah, wasn't he also?
He stepped on a landmine in Vietnam, and he was one of the few people.
Wasn't he also partially against the Iraq War and was quite?
So this is exactly where I'm going. He was aggressively against the Iraq War because he said that Iraq was potentially another Vietnam, and that there would be more American soldiers who would end up like him. And he was swift-boated, and I say swift-boated even though swift-boating wasn't a thing yet. He was swift-boated. He was swift-boated by a Republican campaign manager named Rick Wilson.
The Rick Wilson.
Rick Wilson.
The anti-Trump Republican.
The anti-Trump Rick Wilson is the guy who turned who turned Georgia into a Republican state by saying that a man who stepped on a landmine to save another soldier. Now, I'm against lionizing military heroes for the most part. And I have lots of criticism about John Kerry. But to the credit of Max Cleland, we are talking about a man whose military heroism consisted of stepping on a landmine so someone else wouldn't. We're talking about that Captain America line laying down on the wire. How can you not respect that?
Fascinating.
So this man, he calls this man a coward for his opposition to the Iraq War. I am as far from being a nationalist jingoist as you can get. I do not lionize military heroes, and I am offended by Rick Wilson calling Max Cleland a coward.
But this is what's so. But this is what's so. But you see, this is what's so funny about the Brexit movement and Pumpkinhead Donald Trump, is that people who have been lifelong grotesque Republican assholes get to rebrand themselves as liberals or sane Republicans just because they're against Trump. Just like
Rick Wilson represented the worst elements of the fascist Republican Party under Bush that we all complained about when Bush was president, and that some of us used to justify supporting John Kerry.
Exactly. And in Britain, anyone who supported remaining in the European Union got to rebrand themselves as these nice, wonderful liberals and leftists when they actually were, grotesque capitalist scumfucks like Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, Alistair Darling, and
I remember
stuff like that.
I remember the sad period just after Gordon Brown took power. Because just before Gordon Brown took power, everybody, he's more old labor than new labor, and he was only in Tony Blair's gut, and it's just this whole sort of Gordon Brown's going to be better, and then it's just more of the same.
No, it's unbelievable. It's incredibly unbelievable, but. Ergo, but
it's like how Joe Biden's going to be the most progressive president since FDR. Now, I have lots of problems with Truman and Eisenhower and LBJ. You can criticize them till the cows come home on so many topics. But if we're just generally talking about genuine economic progressivism in a way that materially benefits working class Americans, Eisenhower was more progressive than Biden. Truman was more progressive than Biden.
In fact, Bernie once joked that that he would tax the rich at 60 or 70%. He's like, not 99% like that communist Eisenhower. Or he said, that's basically like me paraphrasing. But
but that's about.
But again, it just goes to show you how much to the right everybody has been pivoted to. Obama pivoted so many people to the right when it comes to civil liberties, when it comes to attacking whistleblowers, when it comes to lighting places like Syria and Libya on fire, and Ukraine. Obama pivoted many people to the effing right.
Obama was the candidate who was chosen because Hillary Clinton was too aggressively pro-war. And who then let the CIA off the hook and made the CIA torture man his closest national security advisor.
In fact, I remember when Obama was running for office, and I just was not impressed with Obama. But because of the corporate media, because of Obama's very good, propagandists and professional liars. I remember, I would see, Obama in debates, and then I would hear Dennis Kucinich and Mike Gravel, and I kept saying to people, why aren't you guys supporting Dennis Kucinich and Mike Gravel? They're old school New Dealer Democrats, and they're anti-imperialists. But no, everybody was just on the Obama gravy train and so forth. And I knew there were red flags about Obama. The moment Obama was starting to say things like, Reagan was actually not that bad and stuff like that, I said to myself, oh my gosh, please let it be Dennis Kucinich or Mike Gravel. And even though now I'm much better informed when it comes to libertarianism, but Ron Paul was better than Obama. Ron Paul was to the left of Obama.
I understand.
And so forth.
I understand why people think Ron Paul is an imperialist. I do, but the man is a Nazi, not an anti-imperialist. It's very important to understand the difference between
your words, not mine.
the isolationists are not anti-imperialists. The best comparison I can make to Ron Paul is that Warren G. Harding was elected on a rejection of the League of Nations based on the idea that the United States should not be involved in future European wars. But he did not pull troops out of Central America, which Woodrow Wilson had invaded even before joining World War I in what's called now the Banana Wars. In fact, Warren G. Harding sent more troops to Central America, and they were not all brought home finally until Herbert Hoover was president. And in fact, Herbert Hoover, one of the reasons that he was so resistant to being tougher with the Germans, despite being pretty tough with the Japanese, Herbert Hoover had been elected on a promise to get the U.S. Army out of Central America, which he kept. Maybe the last time a Republican, well, no, I won't, but maybe one of the few examples of a modern president keeping a campaign promise.
It's crazy, and we see but this leads to an interesting topic, which is, why do you feel so many leftists, and I won't name names, but why are so many leftists? How can I say this? Okay, we see somebody like Donald Trump. We see somebody like the Brexit movement led by Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson and so forth. And even if people don't get transgenderism and so forth, we know that the right engaging in transphobia, that should be a huge red flag for us to mobilize to push back against the far right. And yet, like when there was the big debates about, vaccine mandates and so forth, it's mostly led by reactionary libertarians and so forth. And yet, I see so many leftists either not taking seriously the rise of the far right, or they're because Tucker Carlson says, him and
so as
all these other reactionary far right stuff.
Well, as my colleague and co-host Bess asks here, how come so many leftists aren't really left?
Very much, it's crazy.
And so in the United States, the answer is simply because there is a failure to understand what things like socialism are. When people like Glenn Greenwald, who has always been a right-wing libertarian with a specific crush on white nationalists, probably because he has a uniform fetish, but I can't say for sure. But Glenn Greenwald has said he believes that both he and Tucker Carlson are socialists. Now, there are socialists who accept that because they believe Glenn Greenwald is a socialist. So they accept when he says Tucker Carlson is a socialist because he opposes neoliberalism. Now, Glenn Greenwald doesn't say what he believes neoliberalism to be or how he sees Tucker Carlson opposing it. And Glenn Greenwald seems to genuinely be using neoliberalism as some sort of code for actual liberalism in the social liberalism sense. Because if you look at it that way, Tucker Carlson opposes liberalism. Yes, that's true. But he does not oppose neoliberalism.
But then why do you feel and let's name names. Let's not beat around the bush. So I remember I remember being a fan of the Jimmy Dore show. Jimmy, smart guy, much smarter than people gave him credit for. In fact, when Brexit happened, watch a clip of him talking about it with the Young Turks. He got it spot on. And I loved Jimmy for his defense of Dr. Jill Stein. Loved that he went out of his neck to push back against the war on Syria and so forth. And he very much was an advocate that we need to be doing Greens and so forth. But then COVID came, and he basically started to prop up the reactionary far right and the libertarians when it came to the whole anti-vax mandate and so forth.
The citations for this are in the Twitter feed of Jen Elizabeth Dyes, who is a sort of lefty journalist. But to answer your question, he was being paid by a billionaire named Peter Allard, who was giving money to lots of quote unquote independent media channels as part of so-called philanthropy, and that then made that money conditional at a certain point in time on them adopting certain COVID denial narratives. The journalist in question stopped taking the money at that point and said, no, I won't do it. Jimmy Dore kept taking the money and has gotten more right-wing ever since. Now, that said, Jimmy Dore was always kind of right-wing. Jimmy Dore, for years, has been advocating red-brown coalitions with people like Mike Cernovich and Ron Paul.
Yeah.
And Tulsi Gabbard, who is, of course, now outed herself as completely fascist.
Oh, very much so. Very much so.
And whose progressive turn was always an act and an op on her part.
Exactly. But okay.
So number one, Jimmy Dore is a person of his class. His father was a cop. And while he tells lots of stories about what a horrible person his father was, Jimmy Dore is a part of that macho culture from which telling stories about what a terrible person his father was makes him more of a man. And who can say where the truth stops and the macho bullshitting starts? My father was a horrible guy who burned me with cigarettes. Now, that might be true, but that also might be something that Jimmy Dore says because he kind of thinks that maybe parents should spank their kids now. And I just bring that up because that's a very real strain in male culture. People who are progressive on many other issues will say, well, my parents whipped me and I turned out better than these kids who aren't getting whipped.
I also think...
But that's a reactionary tendency. But
I also think him playing footsie with the far right, and I do include libertarians in the far right. Him, Glenn Greenwald, the Gray Zone led by Max Blumenthal. I think them playing footsie with the far right when it comes to anti-lockdowns, anti-masks, anti-vaccine mandates, I think,
and on
yeah,
Syria, it's important to understand that even though the gray zone adopted the right position on Syria in a lot of ways, the gray zone was also feeding misinformation for what right-wing pro-Islamist groups in the American security establishment. When liberals try to trash Jimmy Dore and Aaron Mate and Max Blumenthal with they're Assadists, what they
yeah.
mean is they were taking money from Republicans who wanted to see less engagement in Syria.
But not like Republican institutions, but like
Like
libertarians.
Republican donors and nonprofits set up by Republican donors, which is to say front groups that isolationist front groups with convincingly anti-imperialist names, like America First, for example,
Uh-huh.
because that's a standard isolationist sort of thing. There's also been a lot of cosplaying as anti-establishment on the American right since a man named William Luther Pierce named his very right-wing and Nazi interview show American Dissident Voices.
Mm.
There is a putatively left-wing Twitter show called Do Dissidents that frequently raises up Tucker Carlson and other far-right figures and pays them credence and respectability. And that always looks to me as my honest assumption, and I'm not trying to bad jacket anybody. I'm really not. But my honest assumption is always those people are libertarian ops taking money from somebody.
That, or they have libertarian blind spots, and America is, and Americans, it's not their
Yes.
fault, but libertarianism is a very uniquely American thing. I mean, look, Ayn Rand, the godmother of libertarianism and so forth. I saw a documentary on her in which studies have shown that the most popular pieces of literature in America are the following: the Bible and all of its various volumes, and then Ayn Rand, both fictional and non-fictional.
And you know what's really both badly written in many places.
And libertarianism. I personally like Gary Johnson's definition of libertarianism, which is fiscal conservatism but socially liberal. That is libertarianism.
Except he was an anti-abortion Republican. So he was lying to you. I mean, that may be a good definition of libertarianism, but he was lying to you about being that. Now, I remember this because that is what one of my friends, who is now much more of what I would call a proper anarchist than a libertarian, for which I am happy. But one of my friends was really, really, really boosting Johnson, saying, well, he's a fiscal conservative and a social liberal. He's against abortion, but he would never, ever legislate against it. And it's like, yeah. He says that now, just like Mitt Romney said that when he was governor of Massachusetts, Gary Johnson said that when he was governor of New Mexico, because he was red governor of a blue state that was never going to tolerate that. As soon as Gary Johnson actually won the presidency because enough Republicans crossed over to vote libertarian, he would absolutely assume mainstream Republican positions in order to be reelected as a Republican.
He would also do that. He would also do that stupid thing which libertarians do, which is if California wants to have single-payer health care, let them. But me in Iowa, I want to have my own private health care, which is also what people talk about, like state rights. If this state wants to have abortion, let them. If that state wants to have it,
Except it's Joe Biden's.
It becomes just an incoherent mess after a while.
It's Joe Biden's respect for states' rights, which he believes in as a Dixiecrat. I want to be clear about this. Joe Biden believes in states' rights as a Dixiecrat. That stops him from doing anything to help people in states that are unconstitutionally. I don't care what the Supreme Court says. We know how they got to be on the Supreme Court. Unconstitutionally violating people's rights to be themselves or to have an abortion. He's doing nothing to help people in those states because he believes in states' rights.
Exactly. Which was also always code for, can I please rule over the niggers and wipe out the Native Americans?
I'm going to go a step further on, and even the most left movements in the history of America have been bad on the Native Americans.
Exactly. If America was a caste system, the Native Americans would be the Dalits, or it would be the acceptable form of racism.
The Native Americans, the Native Americans. The only reason that Black people are the Palestinians of America instead of Native Americans is because there are more Black people. And there's a reason there are fewer Native Americans than Black people. And that is what the U.S. would like to, and that is what Israel would like to do to the Palestinians.
Exactly. But going back to why are supposedly left-leaning people playing footsie with the far right and not pushing back harder against the rise of the far right? I have this theory, and I'm curious your response to it. So when Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn stepped onto the scene, it really inspired so many people to come out of the closet and be proud leftists and so forth. And Jeremy Corbyn, who on paper was great on both socialism at home and anti-imperialism abroad. Bernie, I think we overlooked actually how much of an imperialist he was. But the fact of the matter is, like, he inspired many people to join a movement.
Bernie was someone whose imperialism was overlooked because it was seen as something that was necessary for his political career.
Exactly.
It was a decision that people chose to make, and they chose to ignore some of the danger signs because they remembered him going to Managua and Moscow when he was mayor of Burlington.
And when he sometimes says things like, I would never praise somebody like Henry Kissinger and so forth. Okay, yeah. But all that said, he really did inspire a movement where I knew people who were capitalists their entire lives. Again, I know many people who are upper bourgeoisie and upper class. And he actually converted, both Bernie and Jeremy Corbyn to an extent, converted those people to, hey, I'm actually all right with socialism and all this lefty stuff. And I think the moment Bernie threw his movement under the bus by not supporting the DNC lawsuit and recycling anti-Russia conspiracy theories, and then they saw how disappointing he was against Joe Biden, always calling him my good friend.
Undercutting his argument to be running against the Democratic machine by publicly embracing Joe Biden, the Democratic crooked machine politician, as his buddy, and throwing Zephyr Teachout, an anti-machine, anti-corruption hero, under the bus to do it.
Okay, so you have that in the U.S., and then you have in England, Jeremy Corbyn throwing his own friends, his own people power movement under the bus and not calling bullshit to the anti-Semitism smear campaign and slander.
Interesting fact. Some people associated with Corbyn and some people associated with Bernie were probably ops for the very people that they were accused of. For instance, Chris Williamson works for Press TV now.
Yes, I know Chris. In fact, I met him when I was a reporter for Black Agenda Reports. This was my press badge,
Sure.
my press badge, and Chris has been on my program a couple of
But
times.
but
Yeah,
no, sure. And I'm not. But I want to note that he works for Press TV. Now, state media is state media. We were talking about RT and the facts of how RT is manipulated by a nationalist capitalist regime. Press TV is state TV in Iran. It is manipulated by a nationalist capitalist theocratic regime. Chris Williamson has embraced the British equivalent of the American bottom unity movement I was talking about, where right wingers say they want to embrace left wingers, and left wingers hug right up to them and say, these are our guys.
and in fact, and George Galloway, who I love George on his anti-imperialism, I love George on his Palestine solidarity, I love George Galloway when it comes to forth.
I wish he
That
could
being
give up
said,
his transphobia.
I want him to stay in that lane, because the moment George Galloway talks about immigration, transgender rights, and him complaining about too much wokeism and his hatred for liberalism, and he is on record on saying he prefers blue labor than a Trotskyist. Now that being said, I think that the reason why so many people have been playing footsie with the far right and even embracing them is because of Jeremy Corbyn's betrayal of not calling BS to the anti-Semitism stuff, and Bernie Sanders' betrayal of not
so
lawsuit,
here's the thing:
recycling CIA propaganda and then endorsing Joe Biden. And what that does to people, that makes people so angry that they start to overlook the far right's racism, xenophobia, transphobia.
I have to say this on behalf of a friend of mine that I lost contact with when they left all their online communities over some of the stuff that we're talking about. Their handle on Twitter was Lefty Jew. They were anonymous so as to not mess up with their real life too much. They were a Jewish American anti-Zionist living in England, working in England, a British citizen, and a member of the left Corbyn Labour faction.
Yeah.
Now, what she would have told me was that absolutely some of these lefties around Corbyn are anti-Semitic. She would say that straight up. Now, she would also say they are not any more anti-Semitic than all the other British people that I deal with every day. Yeah. Anti-Semitism is a British problem. It is a deep British problem on almost the same level as racism against Black people in America. And on some levels is worse than the more obvious racism against Black and brown British people because it's more easily hidden.
Yeah.
And she said that very frankly. And she said that she believed that certain people, and one of the names she named was Chris Williamson, were in fact anti-Semitic on some level, while at the same time saying that the people who were accusing them of anti-Semitism were equally anti-Semitic and who more deeply embraced policies that would actually hurt Jewish people in Britain and who supported actual British Nazis. And so if she had to choose between anti-Semites, she would embrace Chris Williamson and people like him in the Labour Party over the people actively supporting Nazi governments in Britain.
Well, me knowing Chris personally a bit, I can honestly say that he is not an anti-Semite. But what is happening, I know he's now part of George Galloway's Workers' Party of Britain, and I don't know. I don't believe they're anti-Semitic.
My view of George,
but Galloway has been playing footsie. Look, George Galloway in a nutshell is blue labor. George
I
Galloway
will,
is blue labor.
I will
And
never be convinced, and I don't care how many times people try to convince me otherwise. I will never be convinced that anybody who embraces anti-LGBTQ plus ideologies is not anti-Semitic, no matter how above suspicion they appear to be. I will never believe it. Because the base anti-LGBTQ plus ideology in Europe and the West is based on an anti-Semitic conspiracy myth.
Of like cultural Marxism, you mean?
No, it's so the speech was roughly, please forgive me for paraphrasing, close to something that actual Nazis said. These Jewish sexologists are feminizing Aryan men. And then they burned the books, and then they burned down the clinic. And that's when the first woman to have gender reassignment surgery disappeared.
Wow. Well, that's it.
So the question that you always need to ask, the question that you always need to ask when people defend anti-LGBTQ plus people as not at all Nazis and allies of the left, the question you have to ask is, what books did the Nazis burn?
Fascinating. No, that is interesting. That is interesting. I will still say the following.
And I'll go one step further and say that when you scratch someone who opposes sex work and dislikes sex workers, a transphobe bleeds. And when you scratch a transphobe, a Nazi bleeds.
No, but on that, I do agree with
you.
They
are the acceptable bigotries that the Nazis hope to exploit.
Exactly, and I think that's where we come. I think that's where we sort of come full circle.
Both Jimmy Dore and Max Blumenthal's wife and Chris Hedges and several other prominent American leftists who get a lot of respect from a lot of people have said very suspiciously anti-trans things and said very nice things about the anti-sex work and anti-porn movements. And I'm just laying that out there. And of course, Max Blumenthal's father is Clinton buddy Sidney Blumenthal.
Yes. Wow, yeah, fascinating. I'm a bit speechless right now. But
I'll just say, and so this transphobia, the reason that so many people are willing to embrace Nazism is because they themselves are pulled towards Nazism by a belief that cops are working class.
Yep.
A belief that trans people are somehow bourgeois for being trans people.
Yeah.
And a stubborn decision to cling to specific Bolshevist feminists' writings on sex work without also addressing what those same Bolshevik feminists said about marriage, and without embracing free love, as was done by those same Bolshevik feminists. Because you can't have a serious conversation about sex work without having a serious conversation about marriage and free love.
And I'm still, and actually, I have to say, I'm still quite agnostic when it comes to sex work. There's part of me that sees that. There's part of me that there's part of me that understands the anti-sex work arguments, and there's a part of me that understands the pro-sex worker argument, which is why I don't talk too much about it. But I would love to have a debate between two feminists on that, but the pro-sex work ones don't want to come on for some reason to have the debates. But that's fascinating. But that being said, do you not feel that those who are playing footsie with the far right are just so disillusioned by the Bernie Sanders and the Jeremy Corbyns of the world that when they see such and such a Ron Paul speaking out against the Syrian war, speaking out against the Ukraine war,
when we're talking about the people who watch Jimmy Dore or the people who read Max Blumenthal, yes, I think a lot of people embrace that because they are disillusioned.
And so they're willing to overlook
and also because they
xenophobia, the far right red flags,
and they respect them on so many other things. They respect them on so many other things that they either don't care about those other things or they sort of agree with them on those other things and so aren't going to criticize it. And because again, we're talking about acceptable bigotries. Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, which is genuinely a funny movie, is also in retrospect an anti-trans Shaggy Dog joke from beginning to end.
In fact, one of the most popular horror suspense films, Silence of the Lambs, and also Basic Instincts, many people from the LGBT community were protesting Basic Instincts because it was a lesbian bisexual woman is actually a murderous slut trope. Yes. And Silence of the Lambs, there you go. Serial killers are actually, like trans peoples are secret serial killers that you have to watch out for. And a lot of people who engage in transphobia on the left, this is where I will agree with you on Chris Williamson. What do they often talk about? A transgender person assaulted a female prisoner. Ergo, we cannot embrace transgenderism. Which to me, it's like, look, if you believe in women's rights, you wouldn't even be supporting prisons.
So this is the real.
Because the biggest threat to female prisoners is the fucking cop, the guard, man or woman.
And this is where this is where I come back to my criticism. All due respect to someone you know and like, this is where it comes back to, yeah, that's what they said before they lynched Emmett Till.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're seeing. We're seeing an embracement of the argument again for lynching Emmett Till as the fundamental argument for, quote unquote, protecting women from trans people. So let's not forget that.
And this is why I have my red flags. Just because once upon a time Piers Morgan was against the Iraq war doesn't mean that he's a good person.
Exactly.
Because that same Piers Morgan only was against the Iraq war because millions of people took to the streets. That same Piers Morgan was arguing with Ron Paul and others, why don't you support sanctions on Iran when they clearly have nuclear weapons, and that clearly is an Islamist state. And just because, and look, just because some people are great at debunking Syria propaganda does not mean you should listen to their points of views when it comes to COVID.
And
the fact of the matter is this: I understand why so many people have a fuck the system, fuck the world, let it all burn to the ground sort of attitude. But that does not mean that you prop up somebody like RFK Jr.
Well, the good news is
because RFK Jr. He's no Ralph Nader. He's no Dennis Kucinich, and he's not even running like Bernie on single-payer health care. Anyone who's propping up RFK Jr., I'm sorry, you've completely lost the plot. You're not a leftist. You're just a libertarian who engages in anti-imperialism.
I mean, if you and you know, if you there are two soft anti-vaxxers, Jill Stein and Cornel West, running on the actual left. If you're a leftist who kind of has some sort of discomfort with what you see as a government vaccine agenda, why are you choosing RFK Jr. over people on the left who are already sympathetic to your position? It's because you care more about that issue than you care about all the left stuff.
Exactly. And I think it just goes to show that they really are libertarians. They're a libertarian that believes in single-payer health care, but still a libertarian in the end. And they're a libertarian that cares more about anti-imperialism than they do about lowering taxes and deregulation. So they're moderate libertarians.
And currently, the U.S. Libertarian Party is controlled by a group called the Mises Caucus, and they're Nazis. And I don't say that lightly. They're Nazis.
And, you know, Ludwig von Mises, was way more of a fucking fascist than Milton Friedman, who was a fascist, but that Latin American, that Latin American kind of fascist of like a Pinochet. And
von Mises' protege was Hermann von Hoppe. Von Hoppe was one of the Austrian school economists who ran down to Chile to help Pinochet's government put together market-based reforms for the CIA, and who defended things like throwing people from helicopters for being gay or communist. That's who's running the Libertarian Party now. The von Hoppe libertarians, who have always been there, but used to hide behind people like Ron Paul.
Exactly. And Reason Magazine, the Libertarian Bible, the Libertarian Magazine. Mark Ames, very great journalist. Yes, can be very controversial, or as I prefer to say, controversial, but controversial too. Exposed that Reason used to publish pro-apartheid shit.
Yes.
Holocaust denialism.
And yet even Reason, who I consider to be kind of Nazi, consider the Mises Caucus Nazis.
And
so why are leftists flirting with them?
Look, Milton Friedman even called himself a libertarian. Alan Greenspan, Alan Greenspan, when he was being grilled by Naomi Klein on Democracy Now! Alan Greenspan was also good friends with Ayn Rand, but he kept insisting
that's what I was going to say.
Naomi Klein was grilling him that he was a libertarian.
Oh yeah. Oh, Alan Greenspan was a member of the quote unquote collective, lived with Ayn Rand, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be trying to go for add sex to the show to grab for ratings or anything like that, and I'm not trying to slut shame either. More power to them.
Yeah.
But everyone in there was fucking Ayn Rand. She was not a believer in monogamous marriage.
Yes, and in fact, she insisted to have an affair with a member of the member, and when he kind of wanted to like break it off, they then like expelled the guy.
And which and she herself in her fiction, all of her love stories include a rape. As part of the process of the lovers realizing they love each other, the dude rapes her. What?
Unbelievable.
Okay. So I'm being told I have to stop.
All righty. Well, listen, this was an epic An epic 2 hour look, epic 2 hours, well, let me just say this before we have to close. Long story short, guys, even if you don't get transgenderism and non-binaryism, if somebody's engaged in it, you best believe they're a far-right douchebag, and they're going to come after your black friend, your Latinx friend, and your gay friend eventually. No to the left-right alliance. We need to convert more people to socialism and Marxism, and we also need to move beyond anti-communist leftism.
And there is no substitute. This is something that anarchists were right about. There is no substitute for actually raising people's consciousness. I mean, you can argue all you want about vanguard parties, but in the end, the Bolsheviks won because there was a mass movement against the Soviet Empire that the Bolsheviks were able to make use of. The Bolsheviks did not vanguard in a vacuum. There was a mass movement, and you can't do anything without a mass movement. And if that mass movement is part of a regular electoral politics and committed to an establishment electoral party, even if you end up voting for that party's candidate as part of a united front, that's very different than joining their party and slavishly defending everything they do and say. And if you believe that it's important to run third parties, then you should support third parties instead of making excuses not to.
And also, apologies to the audience for not responding to a lot of your stuff, but I promise I will respond. And yeah, it's yeah. But that being said, Chris, was a real honor to be on your program. I don't get invited a lot, and again, it's.
I will be inviting you again. I am trying to have people who can come on on short notice if necessary, or participate in panels.
You can definitely do that with me, and in the future, let's definitely have you come on 1+1 to do an election autopsy when either Genocide Joe wins or Pumpkinhead loses, or the other way around. But let's
There's a whole Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison, Grover Cleveland show to do about that. However, it turns out.
Well, listen, it was a real honor, and I'll let you close the show however you do it.
No, thank you very much again for joining me, and I did promote your show in the chat earlier when someone asked where they could find your content, and I will make sure to tweet it later as well.
Definitely, and I'll even post it. Well, I'll even post in the comments section, but I'm sure Chris will do it. And yes, Bess, let's do it. Let's definitely do it. A conversation, a panel discussion about sex work and so forth. I know a person who would love to have that debate, so we will definitely be in touch about it.
Well, thank you very much for your time, and everybody else, thank you for watching, and I will tweet at you.